Today, the Sahara is one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth. Endless sand, blazing sun, and winds that carve the land into shapes that seem alive. You might think it has always been this way, barren and empty. But 12,000 years ago, it was a green paradise. Rivers flowed, lakes sparkled, and thriving civilizations lived, farmed, and traded across its fertile lands. People built cities, developed technologies, created art, and shared knowledge across vast networks. And then it all vanished. One day, it was gone. Wars broke out over water, famine spread, disease followed, and the desert slowly reclaimed everything. Entire peoples disappeared from history. Not thousands, not tens of thousands, but whole civilizations erased in the sands. The story of the Sahara War that caused this is one of survival, betrayal, and human resilience under unimaginable pressure. Today, we piece together ruins, relics, and DNA to understand what happened. But the truth is haunting. Cities burned, knowledge was lost, families scattered across deserts, and myths carried fragments of memory for generations. This is the story of the people who lived, fought, and vanished, and why the Sahara still whispers their secrets. If you're watching this in Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, or somewhere else at midnight, get ready, because this is going to change how you think about history and survival forever. You know that feeling when you realize something you thought was permanent can vanish in the blink of an eye? Imagine an entire people, an entire civilization, thriving in the heart of the Sahara, and then disappearing so completely that for thousands of years no one even knew they had existed. That is the story we are about to explore. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not the vast desert we know today. It was a green, vibrant land filled with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Communities of humans lived, worked, and traded across this fertile expanse, building cities, cultivating crops, and creating a culture that rivaled anything in the world at that time. Yet, for reasons that historians and scientists are only beginning to understand, this civilization vanished almost entirely from history. Evidence of their existence is scattered, buried beneath sand and stone, waiting for modern eyes to piece together their story. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of settlements, fragments of pottery, and mysterious carvings that hint at a society far more advanced than anyone imagined could exist in the heart of Africa at that time. There are traces of irrigation systems, evidence of long-distance trade, and signs of a sophisticated social structure. But for centuries, these clues were dismissed as anomalies, or misinterpreted as belonging to other known cultures. The Sahara has always held secrets. Its harsh, shifting sands erase footprints as quickly as they are made. Entire cities can vanish beneath dunes, leaving nothing but whispers carried on the wind. Yet, in these whispers, the story of the lost people survives, waiting to be heard. The question that haunts scientists is how a civilization that seemed so stable and organized could simply disappear. Was it war, disease, climate change, or some combination of forces that erased their presence from history? Imagine walking through a valley that was once a bustling city. Stones that were once walls now lie scattered and weathered. Canals that carried water to crops have long since dried up. What remains are shadows of lives that were lived with purpose, creativity, and resilience. Every discovery that hints at this vanished society feels like a fragment of a memory reaching across time, trying to tell us something about who these people were and why they vanished. The lost people of the Sahara are a reminder that no civilization is immune to the forces of nature and history. They challenge our assumptions about human resilience creativity, and the fragility of progress. In exploring their story, we are not just uncovering the past, we are confronting the possibility that even the most impressive human achievements can be erased, leaving behind only traces and mysteries. This is the beginning of a journey into one of history's greatest enigmas, a story of survival, brilliance, and ultimate disappearance. As we follow the fragments of their legacy across the sands, we will encounter evidence of a civilization that once flourished, and we will ask ourselves the same question that has haunted historians for generations. What really happened to the people of the Sahara? Long before the Sahara became the vast, empty desert we know today, it was a land of rivers and lakes that sparkled under the sun. Imagine walking along shores where crocodiles swam and hippos wallowed, surrounded by green grasslands that stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was alive with life, a place where humans could thrive. People built villages along the banks of freshwater lakes, digging canals to irrigate fields filled with grains, legumes, and vegetables. Herds of cattle and goats grazed on the fertile land, and wild animals roamed freely across the plains. The sky was bright and clear, and seasonal rains made the rivers swell, feeding the communities that depended on them. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, connecting villages and cities with one another. People exchanged pottery, tools, and exotic goods from distant lands. This was not a primitive existence. The people of the Sahara had knowledge of agriculture, animal husbandry, and water management that allowed them to thrive in an environment that could have been harsh but was abundant. Houses were built from mud bricks, often clustered into small settlements that became larger towns over time. Some of these towns had streets, public spaces, and places of worship. Art and culture were flourishing, with carvings, figurines, and paintings that told stories of daily life, spiritual beliefs, and encounters with the natural world. Children learned how to hunt, fish, and farm from a young age, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Families were tightly knit, and communities depended on cooperation to survive and prosper. The rivers of the Sahara were like lifelines. They provided water for crops, animals, and people. Fishing was common, and fish became a reliable source of protein. Along the waterways, reeds were harvested to make mats, baskets, and even small boats that helped with transportation and trade. The Sahara's landscape was diverse, with rolling hills, lakes surrounded by reeds, and patches of woodland where acacia and palm trees offered shade. Birds filled the skies, and insects buzzed around flowers and crops. Life was abundant, and for thousands of years, the region remained stable and fertile. This was a world that required careful management and respect for nature. People adapted to seasonal changes, learned which plants were edible, and developed methods to store food for drier periods. Villages were often connected by paths that followed the rivers, creating networks that allowed ideas, technology, and culture to spread. The Sahara was a place of opportunity, where human ingenuity allowed communities to flourish and grow. It was a landscape of abundance, not scarcity, where survival was possible through cooperation, skill, and knowledge. But even in a land that seemed so full of life, the seeds of change were already being planted. The climate would shift, and the rivers would begin to dry. The abundance that people relied on would fade, and the challenges ahead would test the ingenuity and resilience of every community. For now, though, the Sahara was a living, breathing world, full of potential and promise, a cradle of civilizations that history would almost forget. The people of the Green Sahara were unlike anything most historians had imagined. They lived in settlements along rivers and lakes, creating communities that were both organized and vibrant. Their houses were built from mud bricks, some with multiple rooms, courtyards, and spaces for livestock. Streets connected neighborhoods, and public areas were used for gatherings, trade, and rituals. Agriculture was at the heart of their society. They grew grains, legumes, and vegetables, using irrigation systems that channeled water from rivers into fields. Crops were stored for lean seasons, ensuring that even dry years could be survived. Herds of cattle, goats, and sheep grazed on grasslands, providing food, clothing, and materials for trade. They were skilled in domestication and animal husbandry, understanding breeding and seasonal migration patterns. Technology flourished. Tools were crafted from stone, wood, and bone, carefully shaped for hunting, farming, and construction. Pottery was widespread, often decorated with symbols and patterns that indicated ownership, family, or clan affiliation. The people understood metallurgy and used copper for small tools and ornaments, showing a sophistication that surprised modern researchers. Trade connected communities across the Sahara. Rivers acted like highways, allowing goods to flow between settlements. Salt, gold, and other precious materials were exchanged for food, tools, and luxury items. People travelled hundreds of miles to obtain what they could not produce themselves, creating networks that spread technology, ideas, and culture. Social structures were complex. Families formed the backbone of society, with extended families living together and supporting one another. Leaders emerged based on skill, wisdom, and the ability to maintain harmony. Councils of elders made decisions for the community, and rituals reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. Education was informal but effective. Children learned by watching and helping adults, mastering skills that would keep them alive and able to contribute to the community. They learned to track animals, grow crops, build shelters, and navigate the landscape. Religion and spirituality played a central role in daily life. People revered natural forces, rivers, and celestial events, interpreting them as signs or guidance. Ceremonies marked planting and harvest seasons, births, deaths, and significant events. Art and expression were everywhere. Carvings on stone, painted pottery, and figurines revealed a deep understanding of symbolism and storytelling. Music and dance were integral to community life, used in celebrations, rituals, and communication. The people of the Green Sahara were innovators. They adapted to the land, developing techniques to harness its resources while respecting its limits. They created a civilization that balanced survival, creativity, and social cohesion. Their cities were not monumental by the standards of later empires, but they were functional, beautiful, and thriving centers of human life. And yet, despite all their achievements, this civilization would face challenges that no ingenuity could fully prepare them for. Climate shifts, rising tensions with neighboring groups, and the eventual horrors of war would threaten everything they had built. For now, though, the Green Sahara was alive, with people who understood the land, mastered its resources, and created a world that was as sophisticated as it was fragile. Their story is a testament to human ingenuity, cooperation, and the ability to thrive even in what we now consider impossible landscapes. Chapter 4. Climate on the Edge. The Green Sahara was not immune to the forces of nature. For thousands of years, rains had nourished rivers, lakes, and fertile plains. But slowly the climate began to shift. Seasons became unpredictable, and what had once been reliable rainfall started to fade. Rivers that had carried water year-round began to shrink and dry in places. Lakes receded, leaving muddy banks and salt flats where fish had once thrived. Grasslands turned to scrub, and trees struggled to survive. Early communities noticed the change. Fields that had produced abundant harvests began to fail, and herds of cattle grew thinner as grazing became scarce. Water sources that had always been taken for granted now required long journeys and careful planning to reach. The sky no longer promised the same certainty as before. Storms arrived erratically, sometimes drenching the land in a single day and leaving long dry periods afterward. People had to adapt quickly or face starvation. Scientists today understand that these changes were part of a natural cycle, but for the people living through it, the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Shifts in rainfall patterns affected every aspect of life. Crops failed unpredictably, forcing farmers to find new ways to irrigate their fields or move to more fertile land. Herds of animals migrated in search of water, sometimes disappearing entirely from the familiar plains. Trade routes became dangerous, as travelers had to navigate dry rivers and shifting sands. Even social structures were tested. Communities that had once relied on predictable seasons now faced disputes over dwindling resources. Conflicts over water, arable land, and grazing territory became more frequent. Some villages tried to negotiate and form alliances, while others resorted to raids and violence. Survival depended on foresight, cooperation, and sometimes sheer luck. The environment itself became a force of war, shaping human behavior in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Archaeologists studying the region can see the evidence in sediment layers and fossilized pollen. These records show a landscape in transition, moving from fertile grasslands to desert conditions that would dominate the Sahara thousands of years later. Scientists have calculated that the most severe droughts occurred around 10,000 years ago, but the process began centuries earlier. Early humans felt these changes in their daily lives, adjusting planting schedules, building new wells, and creating storage systems to survive longer dry periods. Some groups abandoned traditional lands entirely, moving in search of more reliable water and food. These migrations sometimes led to encounters with neighboring communities, which could spark conflict or cooperation depending on the circumstances. The Green Sahara was still beautiful, still full of life in many areas, but the signs of stress were everywhere. People who had once relied on stability now faced uncertainty every day. Rivers shifted, lakes vanished, and the land that had nurtured entire civilizations was transforming into a harsher, less forgiving environment. This was the edge of survival, the beginning of a period that would challenge human ingenuity, test social bonds, and eventually ignite wars that history almost forgot. The people of the Green Sahara had to learn quickly that the world was changing, and only those who adapted could hope to endure the climate on the edge. As the climate of the Green Sahara began to shift, tensions between communities started to rise. Water that had once been plentiful became scarce, and fertile land was no longer guaranteed. Villages that had once traded freely now eyed each other warily, guarding wells and fields as if they were treasures that could disappear at any moment. Small skirmishes began along the edges of territories. A stolen goat here, a damaged irrigation canal there. Acts that once might have been forgiven now sparked anger and retaliation. These early conflicts were not full-scale wars yet, but they were warnings, the first cracks in a fragile peace. Families gathered in defensive positions, teaching their children to recognize strangers from neighboring groups. Hunters returned with stories of raiders moving through their lands, taking crops and livestock. Communities learned to travel in larger groups when fetching water or hunting, knowing that danger could strike anywhere. Leaders began to rise, who were skilled not just in farming or trade, but in negotiation and strategy. Some used diplomacy to prevent violence, while others resorted to intimidation and force to protect their people. The stakes were higher than ever. Food and water were no longer just resources, they were survival. Those who could defend what they had survived, while those who could not faced hunger or displacement. The geography of the Sahara amplified these tensions. Dry riverbeds that once provided safe passage became contested zones. Small oases turned into points of confrontation. Groups discovered that controlling even a single well could provide leverage over neighbors for miles around. These conflicts forced communities to adapt. Fortifications were built around settlements using mud bricks and stones. Watchtowers overlooked rivers and trade routes. Patrols moved constantly, guarding livestock and crops. Even festivals and communal gatherings took on a cautious tone, with neighbors eyeing each other for signs of aggression. Early conflicts also shaped culture. Stories of raids, betrayals, and heroic defenses were passed down in songs and oral histories. These tales taught children the importance of vigilance, loyalty, and strategy. They learned to read the signs of approaching danger, to recognize who could be trusted and who could not. Over time, the frequency and intensity of these skirmishes increased. What began as minor disputes over resources became organized raids. Leaders coordinated attacks to secure critical water sources, grazing lands, or trade goods. The small conflicts foreshadowed something much larger, a war that would engulf the region and leave permanent scars on the landscape and memory of the people. Yet, even in the midst of rising violence, communities continued to innovate and cooperate internally. Families strengthened bonds, shared resources wisely, and taught survival skills to the next generation. These adaptations would become crucial as the Sahara moved closer to full-scale conflict. The early conflicts were a warning, a glimpse of what would come. They showed how environmental stress could turn neighbors into rivals, and how scarcity could ignite war even among people who had once lived side by side in harmony. Every clash, every stolen goat, and every burned field was a piece of a story that was about to reach a turning point. The Green Sahara was no longer just a land of abundance. It had become a land where survival meant strategy, vigilance, and sometimes fighting for every drop of water and every inch of fertile soil. In the heart of the Green Sahara, a leader emerged whose presence would change the course of history. He was not the first ruler in the region, but his charisma and vision set him apart. His name has been lost to time, but the stories of his deeds survive in the stones and ruins he left behind. He began as a young man in a small village, observing the growing tensions between neighboring communities and understanding that survival required more than strength. People were scattered, fearful, and often at odds over water and land. He saw that cooperation could achieve what conflict never would. With patience and intelligence, he began forging alliances. Village leaders and elders who had once competed now found themselves meeting under his guidance, drawn by his ability to mediate disputes and offer solutions that benefited everyone. Trade agreements were established, securing food and livestock from distant communities. Marriages between prominent families reinforced bonds, creating networks that extended far across the fertile plains. He was a master strategist, not just in diplomacy, but in planning for defense and survival. He understood the importance of strong fortifications, trained guards, and organized patrols to protect the people from raiders and rival factions. Under his leadership, the largest city in the region became a hub of culture, trade, and governance. Markets thrived as goods from hundreds of miles away flowed in. Craftsmen and artisans were encouraged to innovate, creating tools, pottery, and art that showcased the sophistication of the people. he also recognized the importance of knowledge. Scholars, hunters, and farmers shared techniques and discoveries that strengthened the entire community. His council was composed of people with diverse skills, and every voice was valued, giving his rule legitimacy and trust. Yet power was never uncontested. Rival leaders eyed his growing influence with suspicion, plotting behind closed doors and testing loyalties. Spies and scouts moved quietly across the region, reporting whispers of discontent. He navigated these intrigues with a mix of patience and decisiveness. Those who opposed him were often won over by his fairness and vision, while others who remained threats were carefully neutralized through strategy rather than brute force. His presence inspired loyalty and courage. People who had once feared the harsh desert now worked together, sharing resources, defending borders, and teaching their children skills that would ensure survival. Stories of his speeches and commands spread across the Sahara, carrying hope to communities that had begun to despair. Under his rule, small conflicts diminished, replaced by coordinated efforts to adapt to a changing climate. Water management projects were implemented, fields were expanded, and herds were moved with precision to prevent overgrazing. Yet he knew the Sahara could not be tamed completely, and he prepared his people for the challenges ahead. This king was more than a ruler. He was a symbol of unity, resilience, and vision. His leadership transformed scattered villages into a cohesive society capable of withstanding both environmental and human threats. For a brief moment in history, the Green Sahara had a figure who could guide the people through uncertainty, who understood the power of alliances, strategy, and foresight. And it was under his guidance that the stage was set for the conflicts, migrations, and survival stories that would shape the legacy of this lost civilization for generations to come. The people of the Green Sahara were not only skilled farmers and traders, they were also masters of survival in a harsh and unpredictable environment. As conflicts grew over water, land, and resources, they developed weapons and fortifications specifically suited to the desert. Spears and javelins were common, crafted from strong wood with stone or bone tips that could pierce the hides of animals or enemies alike. Bows and arrows were designed to travel long distances, allowing hunters and warriors to strike from afar while remaining hidden among dunes or rocks. Shields made from animal hides and woven reeds protected soldiers in battle and could be carried over long marches under the scorching sun. In larger settlements, walls were built from mud bricks, carefully stacked and reinforced to resist both wind and human attack. Towers and elevated platforms gave lookouts a vantage point over the surrounding plains, allowing early warning of approaching raiders. Trenches and ditches were sometimes dug to slow enemy movements, and natural features like cliffs and rocky outcrops were incorporated into defensive plans. Tactics were adapted to the desert environment. Warriors moved in small, coordinated groups, using the shifting sands and dunes for cover. Surprise attacks and ambushes were common, as controlling the landscape was as important as strength or numbers. Knowledge of the land was a weapon in itself. Guides led units along hidden paths, through dry riverbeds, and over treacherous terrain that could trap larger, less nimble groups. Communication relied on signals, drums, and fires, allowing warriors to coordinate across distances without revealing their exact location. Raiding parties were often fast and precise. They struck, took what they needed, and disappeared before larger forces could respond. The use of fire was strategic, not only for cooking or warmth, but as a tool in warfare. Controlled burns could drive enemies from their positions or destroy crops and supplies, forcing rival communities to retreat or negotiate. Leaders understood that knowledge and planning were just as important as brute strength. Training involved not only physical skills, but also strategy and quick thinking. Warriors learned to read the sky for signs of weather, to anticipate the movements of herds and enemies, and to adapt rapidly when circumstances changed. Even small groups could outmaneuver larger forces through superior coordination and understanding of the environment. In addition to offensive tactics, fortifications included secure storage for food, water, and weapons. Granaries and cisterns were protected within walls, ensuring that defenders could withstand sieges. Barracks for warriors allowed for rapid deployment, and hidden paths enabled civilians to evacuate if necessary. Artisans contributed to warfare by crafting strong tools, weapons, and armor that balanced durability with portability. Pottery containers were used to carry water on long patrols or supply lines, while woven baskets allowed transport of arrows and smaller weapons. Every aspect of war in the Sahara was tailored to survival. Battles were fought not just with strength, but with intelligence, adaptability, and understanding of the desert itself. The people of the Green Sahara learned that the land could be a shield, a weapon, and a trap all at once. Their technology and tactics reflected centuries of experience, innovation, and necessity, making them formidable in a region where survival depended on mastering both nature and human rivals. The first invasions arrived like shadows moving across the sands. Villages that had once been safe and bustling now trembled under the threat of outsiders. Early in the morning, smoke would rise from the edges of towns as raiders attacked without warning. Families woke to the sound of shouting, the clash of weapons, and the cries of people and animals alike. Fear spread quickly. Children were hidden under mats or dragged to secret rooms, while adults tried to defend what they had built over generations. The attackers were skilled, moving swiftly across the desert with knowledge of the land that allowed them to strike and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Civilians watched helplessly as homes were set on fire, granaries looted, and livestock driven away. Panic and confusion became part of daily life, eroding trust between neighbors and testing the strength of social bonds. The leaders of the attacked settlements had to think quickly. They organized defensive positions, barricading entrances, and placing sentries along rooftops and walls. Messages were sent to neighboring towns for aid, but the vast distances and shifting desert sands made communication slow and uncertain. The first invasions were not just physical assaults, they were psychological. People began to doubt the safety of their homes, to fear the journey to fetch water or gather food. Some communities considered abandoning settlements entirely, leaving behind everything they had built for the chance of survival elsewhere. The invaders used strategies that combined speed, surprise, and intimidation. Small bands moved through dry riverbeds, using natural cover to approach villages unseen. Smoke signals and drums coordinated attacks across distances, while scouts identified weaknesses in walls and defenses. The defenders quickly learned to anticipate these tactics, setting traps, digging pits, and using decoys to confuse attackers. Despite these efforts, casualties were high. Families mourned lost loved ones, and children witnessed violence that would shape them for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll was immense, as people realized that the desert they had once relied upon for life could be just as deadly when others understood its secrets. Over time, communities adapted. Drills became routine, with families practicing evacuation and defense. Skills in archery, spear throwing, and stealth became essential for survival. Children learned to move silently, to spot danger before it arrived, and to trust the guidance of elders who had seen previous attacks. The first invasions set the tone for the years to come. They demonstrated the fragility of security, the importance of preparation, and the relentless nature of conflict over scarce resources. Every surviving settlement adjusted, building stronger walls, training warriors, and forming alliances with neighbors who faced the same threat. Fear and resilience existed side by side. While the desert remained harsh and unpredictable, it now held the memory of violence, teaching lessons about strategy, courage, and the human instinct to protect what is most precious. The first invasions were the opening chapter in a war that would reshape the Sahara, erase communities, and leave a legacy of survival against overwhelming odds. The desert air was heavy with fear as the siege began. Villages that had once thrived along rivers and lakes found themselves trapped, surrounded by hostile forces that cut off food, water, and trade. Families huddled inside their homes, peering through cracks in walls, listening to the distant sounds of weapons clashing and the cries of the wounded. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. Granaries dwindled, and every scrap of food became precious. Mothers whispered to children, telling them to eat slowly, to savor each bite, while fathers patrolled the walls, hoping to catch glimpses of approaching help that never came. The psychological toll was immense. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, but fear gnawed at hearts. People grew thinner, weaker, and more desperate with each passing day. Stories spread through the village of families breaking apart under the pressure of children too weak to walk, of the elderly lying silently under blankets. Yet, even in despair, moments of courage and compassion appeared. A young girl named Amara shared her meager rations with her sick brother, knowing that doing so might risk her own survival. A father carried his daughter from the well to shelter, shielding her from arrows and sandstorms, refusing to give up despite exhaustion. These small acts of humanity became lifelines, reminders that survival depended not just on food, but on community and care. Siege conditions forced people to adapt in unexpected ways. They dug wells deeper, filtered water through layers of cloth, and rationed livestock for milk and small meals. Every day became a calculation. Which path to the river was safest? How many pieces of grain could be spared for the next meal? Decisions carried the weight of life and death. Some tried to escape, slipping through enemy lines under the cover of night, only to face the scorching heat of the desert or patrols waiting in ambush. Others stayed, hoping that strength and patience might outlast the attackers. The invaders understood the power of starvation. They blocked trade routes and cut off access to hunting grounds. Fear spread as people watched their neighbors succumb to hunger or illness. Desperation led to hard choices. Some ate roots and plants that were normally avoided. Others scavenged insects, and a few risked venturing into dangerous territories for small animals or water. The siege revealed the fragility of human life, but also the resilience of the spirit. Even when limbs were weak and eyes sunken, people found ways to communicate, share knowledge, and maintain hope. Oral stories became vital. Elders recounted past hardships and survival strategies, reminding the young that endurance could overcome even the harshest circumstances. The siege lasted long enough to change the village forever. Families were lost, homes destroyed, and the social fabric stretched to breaking. Yet those who survived carried with them lessons of cooperation, resourcefulness, and unyielding determination. Siege and starvation tested every aspect of human survival, showing that in the desert, life was precious, fleeting, and never guaranteed. Each day that the villagers endured was a triumph of endurance and human will, a testament to the strength required to survive the Green Sahara when war and scarcity ruled the land. Trust had always been fragile in the Green Sahara, but as the years of conflict dragged on, it began to crumble entirely. Alliances that had once seemed unbreakable started to fracture under the weight of fear, scarcity, and ambition. Leaders who had pledged loyalty to one another now whispered in secret, plotting for advantage or survival. A single betrayal could mean the difference between life and death, and soon every community felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down. In one city-state, a trusted advisor began secretly negotiating with rival factions, promising information about defenses in exchange for protection and resources. The ruler, unaware of the betrayal, continued to send troops and supplies to the front lines, only to find them ambushed or intercepted. Panic spread through the streets as rumors of treachery circulated. Families wondered whom to trust. Neighbors eyed each other suspiciously, and children learned quickly that even those closest could become enemies. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers returned from battle exhausted and hungry, only to discover that their food had been stolen or their positions compromised. Fear was no longer just about the enemy outside the walls. It was about the danger within. In other settlements, rival leaders took advantage of fractured alliances, attacking weaker neighbors under the guise of friendship. Villages that had once cooperated to survive the harsh climate now faced raids from those they had helped. Communities learned to guard secrets, to question messages and orders, and to assume that loyalty was conditional. Betrayal also intensified political intrigue. Councils that had once advised rulers were infiltrated by spies and opportunists. Decisions about resources, trade, and defense became riddled with suspicion. Meetings were held in secret, and promises were tested through observation and loyalty tests. Even the simplest agreements required verification, and every action was weighed against the possibility of deception. Among the people, stories circulated of neighbors turning on one another, of families hiding valuables or fleeing in fear of friends and allies. Survival depended on quick thinking and constant vigilance. Yet betrayal also forced adaptation. Communities developed stronger internal communication, hidden caches of food and weapons, and contingency plans for worst-case scenarios. Leaders became skilled at reading human behavior, learning to detect deception and reward loyalty. Despite the paranoia, life went on. Children continued to learn, crops were tended, and herds were moved carefully across the desert. The lessons of treachery became part of daily life, shaping the way people interacted and making them more resilient, though ever wary. The betrayals in the desert did not just weaken communities, they also hardened them. Those who survived became masters of strategy, diplomacy, and caution. The human drama played out against a backdrop of sand and sun, where every decision carried consequences that could echo for generations. Betrayal accelerated collapse in some areas, but in others, it forged a sharper awareness of danger and a stronger capacity to endure. In the end, the desert itself became a witness to both human weakness and human resilience, recording a story of trust lost, lessons learned, and the unyielding will to survive, even when allies turned into enemies. The people of the Green Sahara faced a choice that no community wanted to make. The land they had depended on for generations was failing, and the threat of war, famine, and disease left them with little option but to move. Families packed what little they could carry, livestock were driven across dry plains, and entire villages began the arduous journey toward uncertain safety. The desert was unforgiving. The sun scorched their backs by day, and freezing winds cut through tents and clothing at night. Water was scarce, and every step required careful calculation. Rivers had dried or shifted, leaving travelers to dig deep wells or risk long treks for small streams. Hunger gnawed at the weakest first. Children cried quietly as their parents rationed food, giving the last morsels to those who could keep moving. Disease spread quickly among travelers weakened by exhaustion and exposure. Fever, dysentery, and infections claimed many before they reached even halfway to safety. Some families were forced to leave behind what they could not carry, burying possessions in shallow graves and hoping to retrieve them later. Raids by desperate groups were a constant threat. Small bands attacked camps at night, stealing food, water, or animals, leaving survivors to rebuild and continue without delay. Scouts moved ahead and around the main group, watching for danger and marking safer paths through the shifting sands. Despite the hardships, hope endured. Travelers encouraged one another, telling stories of fertile valleys ahead, of lakes and rivers that might still hold fish and water. Elders shared knowledge of the desert, teaching younger members how to find edible plants, predict sandstorms, and read the stars to navigate. The journey took months. Children grew taller and stronger, learning survival skills that would shape their future communities. Families bonded through shared hardship, creating trust and cooperation that were essential for survival. The migration was not just physical, it reshaped culture and social structure. Leaders emerged based on skill and wisdom rather than birth, guiding groups with strategy and foresight. Decision-making became collective in many cases, as every person's observation could mean life or death. When the travelers finally reached fertile regions, they were forever changed. The hardships of the desert had hardened them, taught them resilience, and prepared them for new challenges. They brought with them knowledge of survival, irrigation, animal husbandry, and social cohesion. They also carried stories of loss and courage that would become the foundation of myths and histories in the lands they settled. The Great Migration transformed the Sahara and the people themselves. Communities spread across new regions, adapting to unfamiliar landscapes while keeping alive the traditions of the Green Sahara. The journey was brutal, but it preserved life and culture that might otherwise have been lost to war, famine, and desertification. Every step across the harsh sands was a testament to human endurance, to the will to survive against impossible odds, and to the ability to rebuild even when everything familiar had been left behind. The desert had tested them, and those who endured became the seed of civilizations yet to come. The desert was no longer just a place to cross. It had become a force that tested every ounce of human endurance. Sandstorms rolled across the plains like walls of fire and dust, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Travelers could hear only the roar of wind and the rattling of loose stones, feeling sand whip against their skin and sting their eyes. Families huddled together, covering their faces with cloth and holding on to one another as the storm tore through their camps. The heat during the day was relentless. Temperatures soared, baking the sand and making every step feel heavier. Water became precious beyond measure. Streams ran dry or were buried beneath sand, and wells sometimes failed to yield a single drop. Dehydration claimed lives quietly. Children, elderly, and the sick were the most vulnerable, collapsing in the sand while their families struggled to find water. Night brought little relief. Temperatures plummeted, winds carried chill that cut through tents and blankets, and exhaustion made it impossible to keep watch. Survival depended on knowledge and skill. Travelers learned to read the clouds, the wind, and the movement of dunes, predicting when storms would hit and where to find shelter. Some dug small pits in the sand, shielding themselves from the worst of the wind. Others sought out rocky outcrops or sparse vegetation that offered slight protection. The storms were unpredictable, forcing constant vigilance and quick decisions. One family, led by a father named Koro, found themselves caught in a sudden storm. They covered their children with blankets, dug a shallow trench to keep sand from burying them, and used their hands to shield water skins from the blowing grit. For hours, they endured the roar, the stinging sand, and the fear that they might not survive until dawn. When the storm passed, Kuro and his family emerged, battered, thirsty, and exhausted, but alive. This was the daily reality for people moving through the Sahara. Survival was not just about avoiding enemies or finding food. It was about mastering the environment itself. Knowledge of hidden water sources, wind patterns, and safe routes became as important as strength and courage. Small mistakes could mean death. One misstep could send travelers into the path of a fast-moving dune or a pitiless wind, and the desert had no mercy. Communities learned to share information. Elders taught children how to conserve water, how to protect their eyes and skin from sand, and how to recognize the signs of dehydration and heat stroke. Skills were passed quickly, often under extreme conditions, because failure was fatal. Sandstorms shaped more than the landscape. They shaped human behavior, society, and survival strategies. People became adaptable, observant, and resourceful. They learned to endure discomfort and fear, to work together under pressure, and to value every drop of water and every scrap of food. Those who survived the storms carried knowledge that would allow future generations to thrive in a harsh and unpredictable land. The Sahara demanded respect and skill, and every person who navigated its challenges became part of a legacy of resilience, courage, and the relentless will to survive. The capital of the Green Sahara had once been a symbol of strength, knowledge, and prosperity. Its walls rose high, guarding streets filled with markets, workshops, and bustling squares where people traded goods and stories. But all of that changed in a single season. Raiding forces, moving faster than anyone expected, surrounded the city. Smoke curled from distant fires as scouts reported the approach of enemy bands. Panic swept through the streets as families realized that their homes, their granaries, and their very lives were under threat. Defenders rushed to man the walls, but numbers were against them. Archers fired arrows at the advancing forces, spears were thrown from battlements, and shields clashed against swords. Yet the attackers pressed forward with relentless determination. The sound of chaos filled the city. Shouts of fear, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of flames mingled with the whistling of arrows and the pounding of feet on stone. Children were dragged to hidden rooms, elders huddled together, and families prayed for survival. Scholars and artisans scrambled to protect books, tools, and records, knowing that centuries of knowledge could vanish in moments. Some attempted to flee, carrying what they could, but narrow streets and sand-covered alleys became traps. The attackers moved strategically, cutting off escape routes and isolating neighborhoods. Fires spread quickly through the wooden structures, consuming homes, workshops, and temples. Smoke choked the air, making it hard to breathe and see. Looting followed, with raiders taking food, water, and valuables, leaving destruction behind. The capital fell not just because of swords, but because fear and disorder had undermined the city from within. Rumors of betrayal and hidden spies caused confusion and hesitation. People could not tell friend from foe, and in the chaos, even those willing to fight were unsure where to act. By nightfall, the once thriving streets were littered with debris, burned carts, and abandoned possessions. Survivors huddled in pockets of the city, terrified that the next dawn would bring more destruction. The loss was not only physical. Libraries and archives that held the accumulated wisdom of generations were destroyed or lost. Artifacts, carvings, and tools that represented centuries of ingenuity disappeared under rubble and flames. The social fabric of the city unraveled, leaving only scattered groups of people who would carry memories and fragments of culture into exile. The fall of the capital sent shockwaves across the Sahara. neighboring settlements watched in horror, realizing that even the largest and strongest city could be undone. Communities that had relied on trade, alliances, and shared protection were left vulnerable. The psychological impact lingered far longer than the physical destruction. Stories of courage, betrayal, and loss spread through survivors, forming the foundation of oral histories that would echo for generations. The collapse of the capital was a turning point, a symbol of the fragility of human achievement when confronted with war, climate, and human ambition. It marked the end of an era, the moment when the Green Sahara began to unravel. Knowledge, culture, and life would endure only in fragments carried by those who fled, scattered across the land, holding on to the hope that one day the story of their people might be remembered. The survivors of the Green Sahara had no choice but to flee. The capital was gone, and villages across the region had been destroyed or abandoned. Families gathered what little they could carry, tying possessions to the backs of animals or stuffing them into small bundles. The desert stretched before them like an endless sea of sand and stone. Every step was uncertain, every direction a gamble. Some groups followed dried riverbeds, hoping that water might still flow in hidden springs. Others climbed dunes to survey the land, searching for signs of fertile valleys or abandoned wells. Hunger and thirst were constant companions. Children stumbled in the heat, crying softly, while elders guided them with quiet determination. Every day was a test of endurance. Disease spread quickly among the weak and exhausted. Fever, dehydration, and infections took those who could not keep pace, leaving grieving families to continue alone. The journey was also a test of the human spirit. People shared the little food they had, carried the injured, and encouraged one another to keep moving. Stories of past knowledge and traditions were retold around small fires at night, preserving memories of the cities, the markets, and the lives they had lost. Some survivors were absorbed into neighboring societies. They brought skills in agriculture, animal husbandry, and craftsmanship that enriched the communities that took them in. Yet, assimilation came with loss. Names, languages, and rituals were gradually forgotten, blending into new cultures. Others continued west, south, or east across the Sahara, hoping to find safe lands far from the war. Travel was perilous. Sandstorms could appear without warning, burying tracks and hiding paths. Heat drained strength, while nights brought cold and uncertainty. Bandits and hostile tribes made every passage dangerous. People learned to move at dawn or dusk, resting during the hottest part of the day, and to travel in groups for protection. The survivors also carried knowledge of water sources, hidden plants, and desert animals. These lessons became essential, not just for survival, but for preserving the culture and memory of the Green Sahara. Each step into the unknown was a balance between risk and hope. Generations of knowledge had been built in the cities and villages that no longer existed, and those who fled understood that survival meant carrying that knowledge forward. Some found refuge in fertile river valleys far from the desert, establishing new settlements. Others merged with nomadic groups, contributing their skills and traditions in exchange for protection. The journey reshaped the people themselves. They became stronger, wiser, and more adaptable, learning to navigate harsh climates and hostile neighbors. The desert had tested them, but it had also forced innovation and resilience. Flight into the unknown was more than escape. It was the survival of memory, culture, and human ingenuity. Even as many perished, the descendants of those who endured carried fragments of the lost civilization into the future. Their stories, skills, and knowledge would echo across Africa, a reminder that even when cities fall and populations scatter, human creativity and survival can persist against overwhelming odds. War was not the only enemy in the Green Sahara. Disease, famine, and desertification spread quietly, unseen, and deadly, striking communities already weakened by conflict. Families who survived attacks often fell victim to sickness that moved faster than any army. Fever, dysentery, and infections swept through crowded settlements, claiming the young, the old, and the vulnerable first. There was no warning, no strategy to fight an invisible foe. Famine followed closely behind. Crops failed under erratic rains, and irrigation systems that once supplied fields with steady water began to break down. Grain stores emptied, and herds of cattle and goats grew thin, unable to sustain the people who relied on them. Hunger gnawed at bellies and minds, weakening the body and making even the simplest tasks a struggle. Desertification crept across the land. What had once been fertile plains slowly turned into dry, cracked earth. Rivers shrank and vanished, lakes dried into salt flats, and vegetation disappeared beneath the relentless sun. The very environment became an enemy, making survival increasingly impossible for those trapped in its grip. Communities tried to adapt. People rationed food and water, dug deeper wells, and moved herds to wherever the land still offered grass. Yet even the smartest strategies could not always prevent loss. Small mistakes could be fatal, and the compounding effects of hunger, illness, and environmental change often overwhelmed even the most resourceful families. Children suffered first, too weak to walk long distances or help with gathering food. Elders struggled to guide those who had lost strength, carrying the sick and injured across deserts where every step brought new risk. Survival required constant vigilance. People learned to recognize early signs of disease, to purify water, and to forage for roots, tubers, and edible plants that others overlooked. Knowledge passed down through generations became a lifeline, teaching which areas were safe, which foods could sustain life, and which remedies might heal minor illnesses before they became deadly. Despite these efforts, mortality was high. Entire families were sometimes wiped out in weeks, leaving only a few survivors to continue the journey through the unforgiving landscape. The psychological impact was severe. Fear and grief became constant companions, shaping decisions and alliances. Communities grew cautious, suspicious, and strategic, knowing that survival depended not just on strength or numbers, but on understanding the silent forces that could strike without warning. The silent killer was patient and unrelenting. It did not march with drums or wield swords, yet it destroyed as effectively as any invading army. Its impact rippled across generations, reshaping settlements, cultures, and human behavior. Those who survived carried the memory of scarcity and loss, learning resilience, adaptability, and caution. Disease, famine, and desertification became defining elements of life in the Sahara, forcing humanity to evolve strategies, cooperation, and endurance that would echo for centuries. In the end, the greatest battles were not always fought against other people. The deadliest adversaries were often invisible, relentless, and unyielding, testing the limits of human survival in a land of harsh beauty and hidden danger. As the Green Sahara fell to war, disease, and desertification, the culture of its people began to vanish. Language, once spoken in bustling markets and around family fires, faded as survivors scattered or were absorbed into neighboring communities. Words, songs, and stories that had carried history for generations disappeared when there were no longer children to learn them. Traditions that had marked the rhythm of daily life became memories, practiced only in fragments or forgotten entirely. Knowledge of irrigation, hunting techniques, and crafting disappeared with those who perished in battle or famine. The manuscripts, carvings, and pottery that recorded achievements were destroyed, lost in fires, raids, or buried beneath shifting sands. The cultural memory of the Green Sahara became incomplete, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Histories were rewritten by conquerors who imposed their own narratives, erasing the accomplishments and identities of the people who had lived there for centuries. Monuments were dismantled, inscriptions defaced, and the records of marketplaces, workshops, and temples vanished. Survivors carried what they could in their minds, but even oral histories could not survive unbroken across generations of displacement and fear. In some villages, elders attempted to pass down fragments of language and ritual, but with each migration and loss, these fragments became more difficult to maintain. Children grew up in new communities, speaking new languages, following new customs, and slowly forgetting the old ways. Crafts and techniques that had been perfected over decades were abandoned because the tools, materials, or knowledge were no longer available. Farming methods adapted to desert rivers were lost when people moved to regions with different climates. Hunting strategies that had once fed families became stories of survival, told too late to be practiced effectively. Cultural erasure did not happen all at once. It was a slow process, a combination of deaths, displacement, and assimilation into other societies. Each generation remembered a little less. Each migration took away a piece of identity, and each conquest replaced one set of histories with another. Even the names of cities and rivers were changed, leaving only hints of what had been. Archaeologists today uncover fragments, shards of pottery, carvings, and traces of settlements that suggest a once thriving culture, but the full story is impossible to reconstruct. The absence of complete records highlights just how total the erasure became. The Green Sahara's people were not simply forgotten, their accomplishments were actively overwritten and absorbed into other histories. Yet traces remained in subtle ways. Art motifs appeared in distant regions, language elements survived in small pockets, and knowledge of farming, trade, and survival travelled quietly through generations. The story of the Green Sahara became one of survival against obliteration, a lesson in how fragile human memory and culture can be when threatened by war, environment, and conquest. Cultural erasure left a silence that was deafening, but it also sparked curiosity, research, and the slow work of uncovering what had been lost. The disappearance of language, traditions, and knowledge was tragic. Yet it also highlighted the resilience of human memory, which clings to fragments even in the harshest circumstances, whispering the story of a people who once shaped the heart of the Sahara. Modern researchers step cautiously across the Sahara, trowels and brushes in hand, searching for traces of a civilization almost entirely lost to history. The wind blows relentlessly, scattering sand over ruins and fragments of pottery that have survived thousands of years. Every uncovered shard tells a story, yet each piece also raises more questions than answers. Foundations of buildings emerge, half buried in the sand, hinting at streets, marketplaces, and homes that were once bustling with life. Carvings on stone walls suggest rituals, beliefs, and events that cannot be fully understood, leaving archaeologists to imagine the lives of people who vanished without warning. Inscriptions etched into pottery or clay tablets offer glimpses of language and record-keeping. Yet many symbols remain undeciphered, their meanings locked in a time long past. Tools of daily life are scattered across excavation sites. Grinding stones, hunting implements, and simple metalwork reveal skills and techniques that were sophisticated for their time. Scholars examine the arrangement of settlements, trying to reconstruct social structures and community organization from incomplete evidence. Trade networks are inferred from exotic materials found far from their origin, suggesting a people connected across great distances with knowledge of geography, navigation, and resource management. The process of piecing together the story is painstaking. Layers of sand and soil must be carefully removed to avoid destroying fragile evidence. Every fragment is catalogued, photographed, and studied, yet for every answer uncovered, new mysteries appear. Archaeologists work with anthropologists, historians, and linguists, combining disciplines to interpret a culture that left behind almost nothing in the way of written history. Despite the challenges, patterns emerge. The size of dwellings, the placement of communal areas, and the presence of defensive structures suggest a society that was organized, cooperative, and aware of both environmental and human threats. Burials provide insight into beliefs about life, death, and the afterlife. Jewelry, ornaments, and tools buried with the dead indicate social status and cultural values, hinting at a civilization that celebrated achievement and cared for its members. Yet the gaps are immense. Whole cities have vanished beneath dunes, leaving only traces of streets or walls. Oral traditions from distant regions may preserve fragments of the culture, but these stories are altered by time and distance, blending fact and myth. Archaeologists often rely on indirect evidence, inferring behavior from objects and ruins. Every discovery is like a whisper from the past, a shadow of a civilization that once shaped the Sahara but was nearly erased from memory. The suspense of uncovering a lost culture drives the work. Researchers imagine families walking streets that no longer exist, markets filled with voices, children learning skills, and elders teaching traditions. The past becomes tangible in fragments of pottery, stone carvings, and tools, yet it remains elusive, a ghost that cannot be fully captured. Every excavation reveals more about the ingenuity, resilience, and daily life of the Green Sahara's people, but also emphasizes how much has been lost. Archaeology becomes an act of piecing together a puzzle where most of the pieces have disappeared, leaving only shadows, traces, and the tantalizing possibility of uncovering the story of a civilization that refused to be completely forgotten. Beneath the shifting dunes of the Sahara, archaeologists began to uncover relics that spoke of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. Pottery fragments decorated with intricate symbols hinted at a language, a way of recording ideas and events that modern researchers have yet to fully decipher. Stone tools showed evidence of precision and planning, cut and shaped to serve specific functions in farming, hunting, and construction. Even small items, like beads and ornaments, suggested trade networks that extended across vast distances, connecting communities with resources, ideas, and culture. Analysis of metals revealed knowledge of early metallurgy. Copper tools and ornaments had been smelted and crafted with care, demonstrating a deep understanding of materials that required skill, patience, and experimentation. These techniques were sophisticated for their time, showing that the people of the Green Sahara were not only surviving but innovating. Some relics suggested an awareness of astronomy and cosmology. Carvings on stone aligned with solar and lunar events, marking solstices and equinoxes, guiding planting seasons, or serving ritual purposes. These markers hinted at a society that observed the skies, tracking celestial patterns to organize both practical and spiritual aspects of life. Trade networks became clearer with discoveries of exotic materials far from their origins. Shells from distant coasts, minerals from faraway mountains, and rare stones transported hundreds of miles indicated an expansive web of commerce. Communities exchanged not just goods, but ideas, technology, and culture, connecting the Sahara with regions beyond its borders. The sophistication extended to architecture and urban planning. Foundations of multi-roomed dwellings, storage facilities, and defensive walls revealed communities that were organized, thoughtful, and capable of managing both resources and population. Canals and irrigation channels showed understanding of hydrology and agriculture, allowing crops to flourish even as rainfall became unpredictable. Artifacts suggested that education and skill transfer were important. Children learned trades, crafts, and knowledge from elders, ensuring that techniques and cultural practices survived across generations. The relics also provided insight into daily life and social structures. Tools for farming, hunting, cooking, and crafting were carefully preserved, suggesting that people valued efficiency and utility. Ornaments, figurines, and carved stones indicated beliefs, rituals, and a sense of aesthetics. Archaeologists pieced together fragments of storytelling, myth, and memory, glimpsing the intellectual and spiritual life of a people lost to time. Each discovery raised new questions. How did communities communicate across deserts? How did knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and cosmology spread? What rituals and beliefs guided their daily lives and political structures? The sands held secrets that only the patient could uncover, hints of a civilization that combined practicality with imagination, survival with creativity, and technology with art. The sophistication revealed in these relics challenged assumptions about human development in the Sahara, proving that the lost people had built networks, tools, and knowledge rivaling civilizations better remembered in history. Every fragment, every carving, and every artifact was a whisper from the past, telling the story of ingenuity, resilience, and intelligence that had endured for centuries, waiting for modern eyes to discover the secrets hidden in the sands. Long after the Green Sahara had fallen to war, famine, and the encroaching desert, whispers of its people lived on in stories told across Africa. Villagers hundreds of miles away recounted tales of a civilization that once thrived in the heart of the sands, speaking of grand cities, flowing rivers, and abundant crops that seemed impossible in the harsh desert. These stories passed from parent to child, from elder to youth, evolving over generations, preserving fragments of memory that might have otherwise been lost entirely. In some regions, myths described skilled craftsmen and farmers who had knowledge of water, agriculture, and trade far beyond what local communities could imagine. They spoke of families who travelled with herds and tools, teaching distant villages the ways of irrigation and animal husbandry. Some tales spoke of warriors who protected their cities with cunning strategies and weapons crafted for the desert, using the dunes and riverbeds to their advantage. These legends often blurred the line between fact and imagination, mixing historical events with the extraordinary. People claimed that the vanished ones had powers to read the skies, predicting storms and guiding migrations with uncanny accuracy. Others remembered them as teachers and healers who knew the secrets of plants, water, and survival in a changing land. In the stories, the fall of their cities was sudden and tragic, brought on by invisible forces like hunger, disease, and sandstorms, as well as by the betrayal and aggression of neighbouring groups. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining the bustling streets, marketplaces, and homes that had vanished beneath dunes. Folklore preserved not only the memory of places, but also of the people themselves. Names of leaders, families, and heroes survived in songs and poems, though often altered by time and distance. Elders emphasized lessons from these stories, teaching youth about resilience, cooperation, and vigilance, as if the vanished people were guiding them still. In distant regions, travelers told of hidden ruins and mysterious artifacts that reminded them of a past civilization, encouraging explorers to search for traces beneath the sands. These tales connected communities across Africa, creating a shared memory of a people who had been nearly erased from history but were never entirely forgotten. Some myths served as warnings, describing the consequences of greed, neglect of water, or failure to cooperate, echoing the struggles the lost civilization had faced. Other stories celebrated ingenuity and courage, recounting how families endured famine, defended their homes, and preserved knowledge in the face of unimaginable adversity. Modern researchers now study these oral histories, comparing them to archaeological findings and fragments of pottery, tools, and inscriptions. The legends provide clues, guiding excavations, and helping to reconstruct aspects of the vanished culture. Even if the full story can never be known, the myths across Africa keep the memory alive, proving that a civilization can disappear physically, yet persist in human consciousness. Through songs, stories, and whispers in the wind, the people of the Green Sahara continue to exist, leaving behind a legacy that spans continents and centuries, reminding us that history is preserved not only in stone and soil, but also in the imagination and memory of those who remember. For centuries, the people of the Green Sahara seemed lost to history, erased by war, famine, and desertification. Yet modern science has begun to reveal that their legacy endures in the DNA of populations across Africa and beyond. Researchers analyzing genetic patterns have discovered markers that suggest continuity. Fragments of a genome that survived despite the collapse of cities, the scattering of communities, and the absorption of survivors into neighboring societies. These genetic traces tell a story that oral histories and archaeology cannot fully capture. They reveal that even when a civilization vanishes physically, its people continue in the bodies and lives of descendants thousands of years later. Scientists have identified unique sequences in mitochondrial DNA that link modern populations to a common ancestry with the Green Sahara survivors. These markers are subtle, often overlooked, until advanced computational tools allowed for the analysis of thousands of genomes simultaneously. The findings suggest that the genetic imprint of the lost civilization persists, silently shaping traits, resilience, and adaptation in people who have no direct memory of the Sahara. In some regions, these markers appear in high frequencies, hinting that entire communities carry the legacy of those who fled or survived the collapse. In other areas, they are scattered more sparsely, showing the movement and integration of individuals across great distances. The research reveals patterns of migration and interbreeding, mapping the paths of survival through deserts, along rivers, and across valleys. It shows that even in the face of war, disease, and environmental collapse, human continuity can endure. Genes associated with adaptation to harsh climates, resistance to certain diseases, and even traits linked to social cooperation and resourcefulness appear to have been selected for during the period of upheaval. These genetic traits may have helped survivors navigate the extreme challenges of the Sahara, and they continue to influence human populations today. Studying this DNA also illuminates questions about identity and ancestry. People who once thought their heritage was isolated or disconnected may in fact share a common link to the forgotten civilization. The discovery of these traces challenges assumptions about loss and disappearance, showing that survival is not always obvious or immediate. The genetic legacy of the Green Sahara is a reminder that human history is written not only in artifacts, ruins, or stories, but also in the very molecules of our bodies. Every person carrying these sequences is a living connection to a people who endured unimaginable adversity, who travelled across deserts, who rebuilt their lives in new lands, and who left an invisible imprint on generations that followed. DNA has become a time capsule, a record of survival, adaptation, and continuity that defies the erasure of history. The forgotten people of the Sahara may no longer walk the land they once shaped, but in every cell of their descendants, their story lives on, silently testifying to endurance, ingenuity, and the persistence of human life against overwhelming odds. The story of the Green Sahara cannot be told without understanding the climate. For thousands of years, the region had been fertile, filled with rivers, lakes, and grasslands that supported thriving communities. But over time, rainfall patterns began to shift, and the once predictable seasons became erratic. Rivers shrank and lakes dried, creating scarcity where abundance had once reigned. Crops that communities relied on failed with increasing frequency, and herds of cattle, goats, and sheep struggled to find grazing land. The environment itself became a catalyst for conflict, forcing neighbouring communities to compete for dwindling resources. Scarcity pushed people to the brink of desperation. Villages that had coexisted peacefully now eyed each other warily. Water sources became contested territories, fertile plots of land turned into battlegrounds, and trade routes were blocked or controlled by the strongest factions. Climate was not a distant threat, but a daily reality. Every day, families walked farther to fetch water, rationed food more strictly, and monitored their livestock more carefully. Those who failed to adapt faced starvation, illness, or displacement. Extreme weather events compounded the danger. Sudden sandstorms buried paths and destroyed crops. Unpredictable heat waves drained strength, and long periods without rain made wells run dry. Communities had to be constantly vigilant, planning movements and resources with precision to survive. The changing climate also triggered migrations. Families abandoned long, settled areas, moving across deserts in search of water, arable land, and safety from rival groups. These mass movements created tension with the communities already established in new regions, sparking skirmishes and raids. The war that engulfed the Green Sahara was not just a product of human ambition or rivalry. It was fueled by the land itself, as scarcity and environmental stress forced difficult choices and intensified competition. Historians and scientists today see a direct connection between the climate and the collapse of civilization. Archaeological evidence shows abandoned settlements, dried canals, and the remains of fields that could no longer support life. Fossil records indicate declines in both human and animal populations at the same time as evidence of prolonged drought. Climate change did not just weaken individuals, it undermined social structures. Leaders struggled to maintain order, alliances broke down, and communities fractured under the strain of survival. Even when people adapted temporarily, the long-term effects of aridification made sustainable living increasingly impossible. The combination of war, famine, disease, and environmental collapse created a perfect storm, erasing settlements and scattering populations across the desert and into distant regions. Understanding this climate connection reveals that human suffering and societal collapse were not random. They were part of a larger story of adaptation and resilience in the face of a transforming landscape. The Green Sahara teaches that climate can shape the course of history, dictating migration, conflict, and survival. The war, the mass displacement, and the near extinction of populations were all intertwined with the shifting patterns of rain, river, and drought. The desert itself was both battlefield and adversary, forcing the people who lived there to endure conditions that would leave few traces of their existence for thousands of years. The story of the Green Sahara is a reminder that human civilization is fragile, shaped as much by the environment as by ambition or ingenuity. Communities that thrived for centuries were brought to the brink of collapse by shifting rains, drying rivers, and relentless heat. Yet, in the midst of destruction and displacement, lessons about resilience, adaptation, and survival emerge. The people of the Sahara learned to read the land with precision. They understood where water could be found even during the driest seasons, how to predict storms, and which plants and animals could sustain life. These skills allowed them to endure conditions that would have killed less observant or less knowledgeable groups. Social cohesion was crucial. Families and villages depended on cooperation to survive. Sharing food, protecting one another from raiders, teaching children essential survival skills, and passing knowledge from elders to youth became matters of life and death. Those who failed to cooperate often did not survive, demonstrating that human adaptation is as much about community as it is about individual skill. Technology and innovation played a role as well. Tools, irrigation systems, and methods of storing water and food were critical to surviving the unpredictable desert. Knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and construction allowed settlements to withstand environmental stress longer than isolated or less organized groups. The collapse of cities and the scattering of populations also teach the limits of human achievement. Wealth, architecture, and social complexity cannot guarantee survival when the environment shifts dramatically or conflict erupts. Prosperity can vanish in a season, leaving communities to start over in new lands or vanish entirely. Yet the human spirit persisted. Survivors carried knowledge, traditions, and skills across deserts and into new regions. They adapted to unfamiliar landscapes, learned new methods of survival, and integrated with other groups while preserving fragments of their original culture. Resilience is not just endurance, but the ability to transform challenges into strategies for survival. Even today, the genetic traces of the Sahara's survivors endure, showing that survival leaves a lasting imprint on future generations. The lessons extend beyond the past. Climate change, conflict, and scarcity remain pressing challenges for human societies. The story of the Sahara reminds us that adaptation, cooperation, and foresight are essential for survival. Civilization is not guaranteed. It can crumble under environmental stress if knowledge, planning, and social cohesion are absent. Yet the capacity to endure, to innovate, and to rebuild is equally remarkable. Children learning from elders, communities sharing resources, and individuals innovating in response to hardship are behaviors that have ensured human survival across millennia. The Green Sahara demonstrates that even in the harshest conditions, humans can persist, adapt, and carry culture and knowledge forward. Its lessons are clear. Civilization is fragile but resilient. Human ingenuity and cooperation can overcome extreme challenges, but only if societies recognize the forces shaping their survival. The sands of the Sahara hold a story of loss, endurance, and hope, reminding us that the strength of a people is measured not only by what they build, but by their ability to survive when everything seems lost. In the whispers of the wind, the hidden ruins, and the fragments of DNA, the Green Sahara teaches that survival is possible against all odds, but it demands awareness, adaptability, and unity. Even though the people of the Green Sahara vanished from the landscape, their influence persisted in ways both subtle and profound. As survivors scattered across the continent, They carried knowledge, skills, and traditions into new regions, blending with other communities while leaving traces of their culture behind. Farming techniques, irrigation methods, and animal husbandry practices traveled with them, shaping the agricultural foundations of later African civilizations. Rivers and valleys far from the original settlements benefited from innovations first developed in the Sahara, allowing crops to flourish and populations to grow. Craftsmanship also spread. Tools, pottery, and ornaments influenced the design and utility of objects in emerging societies. Techniques for smelting copper, shaping stone, and creating durable storage containers became part of local knowledge, handed down from generation to generation. Even when the people themselves were absorbed into other groups, their skills lived on. Trade networks established by the Sahara communities influenced regional connections for centuries. Knowledge of routes, resource management, and bartering systems provided the framework for broader commerce between communities, linking regions that might otherwise have remained isolated. Oral traditions carried cultural memory, though often transformed by time and geography. Stories of lost cities, heroic figures, and survival against impossible odds were told and retold, becoming myths that inspired later civilizations. These narratives preserved values such as cooperation, ingenuity, and resilience, subtly shaping the moral and social codes of new societies. Linguistic traces survived as well, embedded in words, expressions, or naming conventions in languages far from the original Sahara settlements. Even when these connections were not obvious, researchers can trace roots of terminology and storytelling structures back to the vanished people, revealing a hidden continuity in African history. The genetic legacy of the Green Sahara's survivors also played a role. Populations that inherited DNA from these people carried traits that contributed to adaptation, disease resistance, and social cooperation. This invisible inheritance shaped the evolution of communities across the continent, influencing health, behavior, and even migration patterns in ways only now being understood through modern science. Architecture and city planning were affected by their ingenuity. The layout of new settlements, the use of fortified structures, and the methods of storing food and water drew on lessons learned in the harsh desert environment. These innovations allowed later civilizations to thrive in areas that might otherwise have been uninhabitable. The echoes of the lost people also resonate in cultural values. Emphasis on teaching, passing knowledge, and communal responsibility can be traced to practices developed during the long survival of the Green Sahara communities. Their legacy reminds us that even when a civilization disappears from the map, it can endure through influence, memory, and the continuous thread of human ingenuity. The vanished people shaped the world in ways that are not immediately visible, but are woven into the fabric of African history. Their survival strategies, knowledge, and resilience became part of the foundation for generations to come. In every field of crops, in every tool crafted, in stories told around fires, and in the cooperation of communities, the influence of the Green Sahara lives on. Their disappearance was tragic, yet their legacy persists, a quiet but enduring testament to the power of human innovation, adaptability, and the ability to leave a mark on history even when erased from the landscape. The Green Sahara is a place that exists more in memory than in the world as it is today. Its rivers have dried, its cities are buried beneath endless dunes, and yet the people who once walked its streets, cultivated its fields, and built its monuments continue to whisper through time. Their civilization, so vibrant and sophisticated, was erased by war, famine, disease, and the unforgiving desert. But traces remain in DNA, fragments of pottery, and stories passed down across generations. Standing on the sands today, it is easy to imagine the bustle of markets, the laughter of children, and the hard work of families tending fields that no longer exist. One can picture leaders walking through streets that were once filled with the rhythm of life, making decisions that would shape survival and prosperity. Archaeologists uncover remnants, but even these cannot fully capture the depth of knowledge, culture, and ingenuity that thrived here. Symbols carved into stone, intricate tools, and inscriptions hint at a world lost, and every discovery raises new questions as much as it provides answers. Folklore and oral history preserve fragments of memory, preserving the values, lessons, and achievements of a people who faced impossible odds. They speak of courage, cooperation, and resilience, qualities that allowed humans to endure environments that should have destroyed them. Yet there is melancholy in these echoes. The Green Sahara reminds us that civilizations, no matter how advanced or thriving, are fragile when confronted with environmental stress, conflict, and unseen forces. Cities can vanish, knowledge can be lost, and entire peoples can disappear from the landscape within a few generations. But there is also awe. The fact that fragments survive in DNA, in cultural memory, in the lessons passed across time, reveals the persistence of human legacy even in the face of near annihilation. The story of the Sahara's forgotten people teaches us that survival is not only physical but also intellectual and social. Skills, traditions, and values can travel with those who flee, adapting to new lands and merging with new communities, ensuring that even when a civilization disappears, its essence endures. Remembering the forgotten is a way to honor their achievements and resilience. It is a reminder that human history is not a simple line, but a tapestry woven from countless threads, some visible, some hidden, some broken, and some continuing quietly in ways we are only beginning to understand. The Sahara, with its vast emptiness, becomes a monument not of destruction but of memory. The winds carry stories of what was, the sands hold traces of what remains, and the descendants of its people continue the legacy of innovation, adaptation, and endurance. As we reflect on this lost civilization, we are called to recognize both the fragility and strength of humanity. We are reminded that even when life seems erased, influence persists. Every culture, every innovation, every act of survival contributes to the continuum of human history. The Green Sahara's people may be forgotten in name, but they live on in memory, in science, and in the subtle threads of society that stretch across time. Their story is a haunting testament to what was, a lesson in resilience, and a call to never forget those who shaped the world and then vanished, leaving only echoes for us to follow.